Hello, lovelies. Tonight's story, well, it's kind of a big deal for me to be able to read it to you guys. That's why I wanted to save it for a special occasion, and hitting 1,000 subs is a pretty good occasion. Thank all of you, by the way, so much for making that happen. I wrote this story a long time ago. I'm thinking maybe 2002, and just never knew what to do with it. I remember being inspired to write this after coming across this picture. I was so fascinated by her look, her wicked smile, and lack of fear, even though she's tied to a stake with a fire under her. I'd always sort of wondered how cool would it have been if during the days of witch burnings they got a hold of a real witch, and seeing this picture made me think of that. In fact, the picture so inspired me that it almost felt like this girl was telling me her story and I was only writing it down. I'm aware that Anne Rice also discovered this picture some years later and uses it on the cover of one of her books. I found that out when I went to search for it again. So if there's any credit I need to give for the picture, I guess that's it, since I have no idea where it came from originally. But to me, she will always be Miranda, and this is her story. Samuel Ruark was a vile and hideous wretch of a man. Had he been born several hundred years later, he would no doubt have been a serial sex killer, a human monster whose pleasure came from the terror and agony of his prey. He was very lucky, however, to live in the time he did. As Lord High Executioner during a time of witch burnings, he was able to rape and murder with complete sanction of the law. True, he wasn't officially in a position to pick his own victims, but that really didn't matter. He discovered on the occasions that a lovely young wench had caught his eye that whispered rumors about the wench, no matter how untrue, into the right ears, would ultimately result in her arrest, trial, and death sentence, effectively delivering the poor girl into his clutches. He didn't bother doing that most times. Because of the frenzied paranoia about witches, the law delivered a steady stream of delectable young ladies without any help from him at all. One of the perks of his job was the privilege of having his way with a woman prisoner the night before her execution. It was a privilege he availed himself of with gleeful sadism. Samuel was indeed a man who enjoyed his work. He made his way to the cell where the latest beauty awaited her doom with even greater enthusiasm than usual. This one was a true prize, with her beautiful face, piercing blue eyes, long raven hair that hung below her waist, and from what he'd been able to tell, a gorgeous body with a delightful bosom and darling curves in all the right places. Samuel had become almost painfully aroused at the sight of her. Almost as exciting as her beauty was her demeanor. He'd seen them bring her in for questioning, then again after her trial, and she'd had the same haughty look about her both times. He was very much looking forward to erasing that haughty look through degradation first, then unbearable agony when the fire he was to light would begin to devour her tender flesh. Samuel, wretched though he was, did possess intelligence, and he no more believed in witches than he did fairies or other such nonsense. He knew that the women he executed were merely unfortunate enough to have been put in his path by the accusations of jealous or hostile neighbors, political reasons, or even something as simple as spurning improper advances made by someone influential in the village. It meant nothing that they'd all confessed to witchcraft at some point before they became his. The confessions were nothing but a formality. The tortures inflicted on them would make them confess to anything. Knowing these things didn't cause Samuel to feel any compassion for his victims. Indeed, he saw their misfortune as his gain. As Samuel unlocked the door to her cell, his newest charge, whose name was Miranda, he was aware of an excitement he hadn't experienced for some time. She was kneeling on the stone floor facing the opposite wall, her back to him, her hair like a black silk curtain, covering the back of her torn and dirty gown, nearly covering the gentle swell of her backside. She seemed to be praying, a sight he'd seen many times during a condemned witch's final hours. The sound of the heavy door opening caused her glorious hair to ripple, then swish aside to reveal her face as she turned toward the noise. Then Samuel saw something he'd never seen before under these circumstances. Instead of the terror and despair that usually greeted him upon his visits, the eyes that met his were clear, free of the redness of endless weeping, and unafraid. As he watched her, somewhat surprised by her lack of fear at this point, he felt a momentary but strong misgiving, almost a premonition of doom, when she smiled at him sweetly. "Hello, Samuel," she said in calm, almost lyrical, dulcet tones, as though they were old friends. "I've been waiting for you." Samuel Ruark was so momentarily stunned that he didn't question how she knew his name. Miranda arose from her uncomfortable kneeling position on the hard stone floor of her cell and turned to face the man who was to kill her the next day. She hadn't been praying. She never prayed, neither to God nor Satan. But she knew that humans prayed at times such as this, and she emulated them well. Miranda was a witch. She was neither good nor evil. She just was what she was. She never joined a coven, nor sold her soul to be a witch. She was simply born that way, as was her mother and grandmother before her. She was one of the immortals who walked the earth, never staying in one place for too many years, lest her eternal youthful appearance cast suspicion. Miranda had been alive for nearly 2 centuries, yet she looked no older than a girl of 20. With any luck tomorrow, she would continue to look the same for at least 2 more centuries, maybe 3, before the changes of middle age set in. Ancient though she was by mortal years, Miranda was considered still very young by others of her kind, who also considered her to be headstrong and somewhat impulsive. The Council of Elders was always reprimanding her for what they called her foolish behavior. Miranda knew that mortals were the foolish ones. Their ridiculous fear of witches was an example. Witches resembled mortals in many ways. They just happened to be born with the ability to draw power from the elements, as well as living things. Whatever had started the rumors that witches were evil had endured since way before she was born. If they only knew the truth, Witches were forbidden to use their abilities to harm the mortals they shared the earth with, except maybe under the most dire of circumstances. And even then, it was frowned upon by the elders. As she now stood facing her executioner, she maintained the warm smile that had startled him when he opened the cell door, but she wasn't quite as fearless as she appeared. She knew all about Samuel Ruark and his cruel perversions, and she knew why he was here. The thought filled her with apprehension and loathing, but she needed him. "I've come for what's mine, witch," he now declared, having forgotten his momentary unease. His eyes crudely traveled over her soft, feminine curves, the sight reawakening his lust with new vigor. "Indeed," Miranda replied, raising her chin in a deliberate, haughty manner. "And what is there in this cell that you consider yours?" She feared what she had to unleash by this behavior, but it was necessary. Samuel chuckled, apparently not perturbed at all by her insolence. "You, witch," he replied with a leer as he closed the distance between them in a leisurely way. He was in no hurry, and her attitude secretly delighted him. Most of the witches he took his rights with were already broken by their earlier tortures and their terror of what awaited them. This one's manner gave the impression that the room she stood in wasn't a cell, but a grand home, and she the mistress of it. Breaking her, therefore, would be all the sweeter. He grinned in sadistic anticipation of how badly he was going to debase her, much worse than any of the others. This one was special. She deserved special treatment. "Cooperate with me," he said in a mockingly wheedling tone. "I'll try to make things easier for you tomorrow." It was a lie, of course. He often offered such a deal to his charges, and most of them pathetically agreed, desperate to please him so that he might at least shorten their horrifying ordeal the next day. They would whore themselves, doing whatever he wanted, only to find out too late the full measure of his cruelty. For the next day he would make it a point to burn them even slower, grinning at them wickedly through the heat haze, as they suffered for hours sometimes. What an absurd bargain, as if burning alive can be made easier. Her refusal to cringe or grovel both enraged and excited Samuel even further, and in one fluid movement he seized her in a beastly grip, bruising her delicate arms as he pulled her to himself violently, nearly crushing her lips to his in a brutal kiss. Miranda enjoyed humans as lovers. The raw power generated by making love with one of them always filled her with such an overabundance of pure, joyous magic that she was unable to sleep for days and felt she could do anything at all. The more passionate the encounter, the greater the magic. This encounter, however, was going to be violent. The power source much darker and twisted than she'd ever tapped into before, and it made her nervous. She felt the waves of evil from this man as his lips moved to her neck, sucking and biting savagely. She was terrified of the power she must tap into. She could tell already that it was black and horrible, and much worse than she'd thought. Panic and revulsion caused her to struggle briefly against this evil being intent on taking her. She needed this to happen, of course. She needed every bit of dark power she could draw into herself, but it was easier to accept in theory. In reality, she was shuddering at the sheer horror that was this man. Samuel laughed at her struggles, then slapped her hard across her face, causing her to fall to the stone floor with a cry, blood trickling from her nose. Instantly, he was upon her. At one point, he began to taunt her, saying how she should enjoy the attention. "For tomorrow you will burn. Your lovely flesh will be ashes, and you'll never enjoy another man. You should be thanking me." That was his favorite part, taunting his victims about their horrible impending death. He would often go into great detail of how they would burn, loving their sobs of terror and pleas to be spared. Miranda didn't plead, but she was sobbing hysterically as she endured his cruelty and absorbed the power she was drawing from him. Her tears weren't for herself, but for all the innocents before her. She could feel the agony and despair of all of them, could hear the wails of each and every one inside her head, and she feared it would drive her mad. Much later, Samuel was unlocking the cell door to leave, quite satisfied and looking forward to a good night's sleep, when he heard her call his name softly. He looked back at her, gratified at the sight. She was still sprawled on the floor, mostly naked, bruised and bleeding, raising herself painfully on one elbow while she groped for the scraps of her gown in a pathetic attempt to cover herself. "Yes, my love," he responded mockingly. "I hope you enjoyed that, Samuel," she said in a shaking but calm voice. "It may be your last time as well." At first, Samuel was stunned and angry that the bitch would use his own line against him, but then decided she must have lost her mind. He'd seen it before. Sometimes they just snapped. "Sure, witch slut. Whatever you say." He grinned, then left, locking the door behind him. As he made his way back to his home, whistling a cheery tune, Samuel was struck with a momentary chill, then shrugged it off and thought about how much he'd enjoyed his latest conquest, and how much he was going to enjoy watching her burn the next day. It seemed almost a shame to destroy such prime flesh. Almost. He could hardly wait. Miranda sat shivering in her cell, the scraps of her red gown cast aside for now. Nothing covered her except for the thin blanket from the tiny cot in the corner. She had no intention of attempting sleep. It would be impossible. The cell was dank and chilly, but that wasn't the cause of her trembling. Pulling the blanket tighter around her slight frame couldn't stop the constant shuddering, but she did so anyway. She felt infected rather than empowered by the putrid darkness she'd drawn into herself from her nightmarish encounter with Ruark. It took every bit of her will and concentration to keep from sicking it all up. That was an option, but one she couldn't afford to use. Miranda could have used any number of power sources and simply vanished from her cell in the night. She knew that was what the elders would want her to do. She need not even go near the stake at all. A few times during that long night, she was tempted to do just that. She would no longer be in such danger and could wash her hands of this entire village. It wasn't too late to back out. Unfortunately, in her mind, it was too late by far. The haunting cries she'd heard during the attack, or power transfusion, as she preferred to think of it, still reverberated through her mind. She hadn't imagined them. They were voices who had cried out for help and never received it. Samuel had so enjoyed their cries that they were part of his sexual energy, the cries and the unbearable sufferings of those they belonged to. It was a dark and powerful energy that she needed desperately. But oh, how foul it felt. How awful. Miranda could no longer bide the hard stone floor. She crawled to the straw mat in the corner that passed as a cot and laid down for a while, staring into the darkness. It wasn't much more comfortable, but it would have to do. Every part of her hurt. Immortal she may be, but she could still feel pain, could still be hurt. She could also be destroyed by fire. The perilous position she'd placed herself in did frighten her, more than she'd let on so far. There had been rumors among her kind of immortals supposedly destroyed by fire, burned to ashes, who had pulled themselves together after a century or two. But Miranda had never met one of them and didn't really believe it. As she lay in the darkness waiting for morning, her mind wandered to the events that had brought her to this place, this mission. She thought of how she'd been forced to stand by, as helpless as any mortal, while one innocent woman after another had been marched to the stake, as she would be tomorrow. And felt again her fury at the mortals who were capable of such cruelty, and at the elders who forbade her to step in and help them. The elders, she wondered with contempt, and not for the first time. What made them think they knew best? So they were older and, yes, probably wiser, but they needed to realize that things change. What good were her inborn abilities if she couldn't use them to help, to prevent evil? Many times she'd approached the elders, pleading to be allowed to intervene on behalf of these innocents who were being made to suffer so horribly. But no, they were so afraid of breaking the old codes that they always refused her, along with a stern lecture on the consequences of disobeying them should she try. She would be an outcast, forbidden to have any contact with any other witches, including her own mother. They didn't approve of her interest in mortals and their fates, but Miranda couldn't understand how she could not be interested in the humans she shared the earth with. The simple beauty of their passions, emotions, beliefs, and day-to-day activities during their short lives fascinated and never failed to touch her. Because Miranda didn't age as the humans around her did, she could never stay in one place for very long. Therefore, close friendships with any of them were avoided for the most part. It was just too painful when she had to move on. But because of her interest in them, it was hard not to feel affection for many that had touched her life. She had said many a tearful goodbye to friends and lovers alike. Sometimes she'd been unwilling to face that pain again and had slipped away into the night before they'd realized she was gone. She still ached when she thought of the ones who'd been most special to her. Many of them would be very old by now, or would have passed on. Being immortal, she didn't even have the comfort that humans felt at the belief of seeing their departed loved ones in an afterlife. For Miranda, there was no afterlife. This was it. At times, she compared her lonely existence to the hell so many mortals feared. She knew that to be cut off from her own kind for eternity would be unbearable. So, the threats of the elders were very serious to her, worse than a death sentence for a human. Despite all this, Miranda couldn't help how she felt about humans and the plight they were inflicting on themselves and each other. The witch burnings had always disturbed and distressed her. It went on all over, but lately seemed to be running rampant, especially in this village that she'd called home for the past several years. Evil had taken hold here like a sickness, and it wasn't witchcraft. The evil that had infested this village began as scattered seeds of fear and paranoia, nurtured by greed, lust, and cruelty, then grown to deadly fruition by the perverse, barely concealed delight of humans to witness one of their own destroyed in as much agony as possible. The sickness was spreading, as deadly as any plague Miranda had heard of. Yet she knew that not all humans in the village were infected. There were still good people, but they were afraid to speak out, lest they suffer the same fate. Miranda's grief and rage tore through her once again, and her eyes stung with tears when she thought of the last girl this evil had murdered. Her name had been Laura, and the horrible injustice of what had happened to her was what finally pushed Miranda over the edge and into the position she was in now. Laura was a gentle and lovely young girl, barely out of her teens, who had never harmed anyone. She lived her life peacefully until an evil-infested shrew of a young woman named Christina had accused her of witchcraft, making up all sorts of wild tales about having seen Laura dancing naked in the woods, cavorting with demons, all kinds of lies that the fanatical witch hunters of the village had eagerly believed as though it were gospel. Miranda hadn't believed the nonsense for a moment and put her inner eye on Laura's accuser and saw into the wench's black heart. Just as she suspected, Christina had never seen such things. What she did see, however, was her fiancé Tom stare at the beautiful Laura a few moments too long in church one morning. His look of longing hadn't been returned. Indeed, Laura hadn't even been aware of it, but to Christina, that didn't matter. Laura was unacceptable competition and had to be eliminated. Miranda was horrified by this truth, but she was all too aware that it never took much more reason than Christina's to end up sending an innocent to the stake. Miranda, her heart heavy, went to the elders one last time, literally on her knees, begging them to allow her to intervene. As she expected, they once again refused her request in no uncertain terms, and chided her for forming yet another useless attachment to a mortal. Osborne, one of the sternest of the elders, and usually one of the quickest to scold, had spoken kindly when her anguished frustration had finally reduced her to tears. "Miranda, child, you must understand that there's nothing you can do about mortals and their inexplicable need to destroy themselves and each other. One would think their lifespan were short enough, yet that fact doesn't stop them. We must not interfere. Do you fancy the notion that you can rescue every innocent from their mass cruelty?" "Well, no, but, she'd stammered. "No, indeed. This madness is happening all over the earth, now more than ever. But we can't disrupt their course and draw undue attention to ourselves. Unfortunately, mortals are the majority." Miranda had argued and pleaded some more, but in the end had backed down, too afraid of the consequences of disobeying them. The day Laura had gone to the stake, she'd stayed away, hidden herself like the coward she firmly believed she was. Since then, her rage and guilt had grown to such a level that her plan began forming without her even being fully aware of it at first. So the elders had forbidden her to intervene on behalf of a mortal, but they never said she couldn't get her own self out of trouble. Never mind that she intended to deliver herself to the mortals for the sole purpose of exacting vengeance for Laura and every other innocent she'd seen destroyed. These wicked mortals needed to be taught a lesson. They needed to see what a real witch could do. Miranda, in her agitated, guilt-ridden state of mind, considered herself the perfect witch for the job. She deliberately avoided the elders while her plans formed. She figured if she didn't ask permission, they couldn't withhold it. She knew they wouldn't approve, and their punishment, which she had let so many die to avoid, might well be severe. But Miranda decided to worry about that when the time came. In hindsight, she fervently wished she'd taken her chances and saved Laura at least, but it was too late for that now. However, it wasn't too late to extract a terrible price from these bloodthirsty humans, so infected with evil. Once resolved to her task, it had been easy to get arrested, frighteningly easy. All it took was a few nights of dancing naked in the woods at midnight till someone saw her. She couldn't help laughing as she twirled and chanted some nonsense she'd made up. Such a gaudy ritual had nothing to do with being a witch, but the humans seemed to think so. So she put on a show for whoever may come along. After her third night of the silly ritual, the witch hunters came for her the following morning, just as she'd known they would. She supposed she should act frightened, but it was all she could do to keep from laughing at them outright. Instead, she presented a dignified hauteur when they seized her. Miranda shuddered some more when she remembered her questioning, which was of course only an excuse to torture her. She'd known the pain would be horrific, and she was right. She also knew she could frighten her tormentors into fits if she wanted, by merely vanishing in a puff of smoke. But that wasn't nearly good enough. She willingly suffered the intense agonies of the rack, then the mind-numbing horror of being suspended by her wrists over hot coals as she'd screamed in pain and fury. She hadn't been allowed to help any of the others who'd suffered this, so to suffer it herself seemed only right. Her horrible pain was like a balm for her guilt. Besides, she knew instinctively that raising her threshold of pain would only empower her further. When she'd finally broken and confessed to these fiends, whose arousal at inflicting her pain buzzed at her senses like a monstrous insect, she declared it loudly, unconsciously laughing as tears streamed down her contorted face. "Yes! Yes! Damn you all! I am a witch! I'm the only witch you bastards have ever seen!" Puzzled by her words and ferocity, but satisfied by her confession, the inquisitors ceased the interrogation, somewhat reluctantly, and turned her over for trial. Her trial was of course a joke, as they all were. Because she'd confessed, she was quickly found guilty and summarily sentenced to burn the next morning. Then the visit from Samuel Ruark, the final ritual. For good or ill, Miranda felt herself ready for the morning. By the time the first slivers of dawn had peeked through the tiny barred slit of a window in her cell, Miranda had ceased all real thought. The dark evil she'd drawn into herself from the violent encounter finally felt comfortable, her bitter thoughts nourishing it till it had grown and shifted, and now rested within her like a demon child anxious to be born. She had surrendered to the evil inside her, and now welcomed it as a part of her. She felt quite composed when she heard the guards coming for her. She knew that most of the villagers were waiting in the square, their mood celebratory. They were looking forward to a burning. Miranda was going to show them a burning, one that whoever was still standing would never forget.